On a crisp autumn afternoon, the glittering skyline stretched endlessly from the rooftop of the Rooftop, city's tallest tower. Champagne glasses clinked, laughter rippled through the air, until a moment of pure joy tilted toward unthinkable tragedy. Among the well-dressed guests, 29-year-old housekeeper Lena Brooks moved quietly, clearing plates and avoiding notice. Her trained eyes caught what no one else saw. Two small boys, identical twins in matching navy shorts, darting toward the terrace's edge, chasing a napkin caught in the wind. The twins, sons of recently widowed billionaire Christopher Hale, had slipped away from the crowd's attention. The napkin danced higher, teasing them toward danger, until one boy's sneaker found the first rail. In the heartbeat that followed, both boys tumbled forward, legs dangling over 60 stories of open air. Gasps erupted, but no one moved. No one except Lena. Plates crashed to the floor as she lunged, heart pounding. She gripped one boy's wrist, then lunged farther to seize the other, her heels balanced half on steel, half on nothing. Pain shot through her arms, but she refused to let go. Inch by agonizing inch, she pulled them back to safety, collapsing to her knees as both boys clung to her neck, sobbing into her uniform. Around them, the party had fallen silent. And in that frozen, breathless moment, every guest knew they had witnessed something far greater than quick reflexes. This was courage in its purest form. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the high glass windows of the Hale Tower, catching in the marble floors, and the quiet hum of activity that began long before most residents stirred. Lena Brooks moved with her usual precision, her cart stacked neatly with fresh linens, cleaning supplies, arranged like tools in a surgeon's tray. She had told herself that today would be no different than any other shift. No lingering on the memory of dangling wrists and terrified eyes from the rooftop. No replaying the shouts, the scrape of metal, the sheer weight of two small bodies pulling against her strength. But the truth followed her. From the moment she stepped through the staff entrance, there was a change in the air. Conversations paused when she passed. The concierge, who usually offered no more than a perfunctory nod, greeted her with a warmth that felt almost ceremonial. Two other housekeepers whispered near the service elevator, glancing her way before pretending to fuss with their carts. Even the security guard, his eyes typically fixed on his phone, looked up long enough to say, "Morning, Miss Brooks," in a tone that carried both respect and awe. She didn't need to ask why. The events of the day before had already traveled, perhaps in the comps retelling of guests, perhaps through phone footage that would later spread far beyond the tower. But Lena pushed the thought away. She had work to do. Her cart rattled down the long, carpeted corridor of the 42nd floor. She paused at a suite door on her list, knocking lightly before swiping her key card. As the lock clicked, she heard a faint murmur of children's voices, familiar voices. She froze for a fraction of a second, then opened the door. Standing there in the warm spill of the living room light was Christopher Hale, impeccably dressed as always, though today there was a softness in his posture that caught her off guard. Beside him stood the twins Lucas and Noah, dressed in simple sweaters and jeans, each clutching something small and colorful. "Hi," Noah said, his voice carrying a hint of shyness. Before Lena could respond, Lucas stepped forward, his small hands uncrumpling a piece of paper as if unveiling something precious. "We made you something," he announced with a confidence only children could carry. Together, they held it out to her, a drawing, messy and bright, of a woman in a red dress. Her arms outstretched, two small figures beside her. The skyline rose behind them in uneven crayon strokes. Lena recognized the red instantly. It was the uniform she'd been wearing yesterday when she pulled them back from the terrace's edge. She crouched down, so her eyes met theirs, taking the paper as though it were something fragile. "It's beautiful," she said softly, letting her gaze linger on the uneven lines, the scribbled clouds, the way the boys' stick figure selves were smiling. "That's me," Lucas said, pointing proudly, "and that's Noah. You're holding us so we don't fall." A laugh caught in her throat. "You drew me taller than I am," she teased gently, and the boys giggled, their sound bright and unguarded. When she finally looked up, she found Christopher watching the exchange intently. There was gratitude in his eyes, yes, but also something quieter, an awareness, a recognition of the invisible threads that sometimes tie people together in ways neither planned. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a plain white envelope. Lena instinctively shook her head before he could speak. "It's not payment," he said quickly, reading the refusal before she voiced it. "It's a phone number. Mine. If you ever need anything, anything at all, you call me. Her fingers brushed the edge of the envelope but didn't close around it. Mr. Hale, she began, intending to draw the line she always kept between her life and the people she worked for. Christopher, he corrected gently. Just Christopher. The quiet between them stretched, filled only by the rustle of the boys shifting from foot to foot. It was a strange kind of silence, not awkward, but weighted, like standing in the doorway between two rooms, and not yet deciding which to enter. Finally, she took the envelope, her fingers curling around it slowly, almost reluctantly. She wasn't sure why the gesture unsettled her, not in a threatening way, but in the way it erased boundaries she'd spent years reinforcing. For as long as she could remember, she'd kept her worlds separate. Work and home, serving and living. This, standing here with a child's drawing in one hand, and the offer of a lifeline in the other, felt like standing exactly in the middle of those worlds. Thank you for the drawing, she told the boys, her voice steady, even as her chest tightened. Promise you'll keep it safe? Noah asked, wide-eyed. I promise, she said. Satisfied, the boys grinned and stepped back toward their father, who gave her a small, deliberate nod, formal yet personal. He didn't try to say more, and she didn't either. Some understandings didn't need to be spoken. As they turned toward the door, Lucas glanced back. Bye, Miss Lena, he said brightly. Bye, she replied, her lips curving before she could stop them. When the door closed and she was alone again in the suite, Lena slipped the drawing into the top of her cart, tucking it carefully between folded linens where it wouldn't bend. The envelope, she slid into the pocket of her apron, feeling the faint weight of it with every step she took afterward. She told herself she might never use the number inside. But she also knew, without fully admitting it, that she would keep it. And perhaps, in ways she couldn't yet see, it might keep her too. What had begun as a split-second act of instinct on a windy rooftop had already shifted into something else entirely, a connection, fragile but real, between a woman who had built her life on staying invisible and a family who now saw her as someone they couldn't forget. A week after the rooftop rescue, Christopher Hale called Lena Brooks with an invitation that surprised her. His voice was calm but carried a hopeful undercurrent. The boys keep asking about you, he said. We're going to the park this afternoon. Would you join us? Just for a little while. Her instinct was to refuse, polite but firm, yet she could hear Lucas and Noah's laughter in the background, muffled but unmistakable. Before she could find the right excuse, she heard herself say, just an hour. The park was awash in autumn gold, leaves spinning lazily down from the trees. She spotted them before they saw her. Christopher crouched beside a sandbox, showing Lucas how to shape a tunnel, while Noah made a beeline for the swings. When Noah noticed her, his face lit up like sunrise. Lena, he called, running full speed to wrap his arms around her legs. Lucas followed more slowly, shy, but smiling, a folded paper in hand. I made you this, Lucas said, offering her a drawing of 4 stick figures holding hands. Too tall, too small beneath a crooked sun. That's us at the park, he explained. She crouched to meet his eyes. It's perfect, she told him, and meant it. Eagerly, Noah tugged at her sleeve. You have to push me. Dad doesn't push high enough. Christopher, walking up, raised an eyebrow with mock offense. Apparently, I'm too cautious, he said. Lena laughed, and took her place behind the swing, sending Noah higher with each push, until his delighted squeals drew glances from nearby families. Lucas, standing close, slipped his hand into hers without looking up. Don't let go, he murmured. Never, she promised, feeling the weight of the words settle somewhere deep inside her. They moved through the afternoon in easy rhythm swing sets, sandcastles, and climbing frames, until an hour had stretched far beyond what she'd intended. Christopher sat on a nearby bench, watching them with a quiet expression that looked like something loosening inside him. For the first time in months, the grief in his posture seemed lighter. By the time they left, the boys clung to her with exaggerated groans, extracting promises to come back tomorrow. Christopher walked her to the edge of the park. Thank you, he said, quietly. I didn't realize how much I needed this. Lena only nodded, but something in her chest shifted. The next invitation came 2 weeks later, a simple dinner at Christopher's penthouse. She hesitated before agreeing. She'd never crossed that threshold, except in her work uniform, her presence unnoticed. Now, stepping into the softly lit entryway, she felt the strange weight of being a guest. The scent of rosemary chicken drifted from the kitchen. Lucas and Noah greeted her with small hands pulling her toward the dining table, where polished oak gleamed beneath simple white plates. Christopher poured wine for her and water for the boys. Conversation flowed easily at first, stories from school, the boys' playground adventures, punctuated by their giggles when Christopher feigned outrage at being called too slow for tag. Lena listened, smiled, and folded their napkins into neat triangles out of habit. Then her gaze landed on a framed photograph on the far wall, a woman with sunlit hair and a smile that looked like pure joy, her hand entwined with Christopher's. Lena didn't need to ask who it was. The air between them shifted, just slightly. Christopher noticed her glance, but didn't comment. Instead, he asked about her family. She spoke of her mother's fragile health, her younger brother's studies, the way her days were divided between home and work. She didn't embellish, but Christopher listened with an attention that made her uneasy and seen. The boys, oblivious to the adult undercurrents, carried the conversation forward. Lucas recounted how Lena had caught him on the slide at the park just before I would have flown into the sand, and Noah declared she was faster than Dad. In the kitchen afterward, they moved around each other naturally, her rinsing dishes, him drying, speaking in fragments that stitched together into something comfortable. When they returned, the boys were building towers from folded napkins. Christopher leaned in the doorway, watching with an expression that was part nostalgia, part something unspoken. By the time dessert bowls were empty, the heaviness of that earlier photograph felt softer, less like a ghost and more like a quiet presence allowed to stay. The third meeting wasn't planned at all. It was nearly midnight when Lena's phone rang. Christopher's voice came through thin and uneven. "We're at the hospital," he said quickly. Lucas had an asthma attack, he couldn't catch his breath. "I didn't know if I should call an ambulance or drive. I just ran." She was already pulling on her shoes. "Which hospital?" By the time she arrived, he was pacing near a set of closed double doors, his tie askew, his hands clenching and unclenching. The sheen on his skin told her he'd been sweating, whether from the sprint or the fear. "They said he's stable," he managed. "Nebulizer treatment, oxygen." But, he broke off, the sentence collapsing under its own weight. Lena touched his arm. "He's getting what he needs. You got him here. You did your job." He gave a ragged half-laugh. "I heard him wheeze, and it was like the accident all over again. I swear my brain only has two buttons now, panic and guilt." She took his hand, steady and unhurried. "Then tonight, we're going to add a third one. Breathing." They sat side by side in hard plastic chairs. She coached him through slow inhales and measured exhales, keeping him anchored in the moment. When a respiratory therapist came out to say Lucas was tolerating treatment well, she saw Christopher's shoulders sag with relief. That didn't yet know how to be joy. Hours passed in the quiet rhythm of waiting rooms, signing forms, half-eaten granola bars, the sound of distant monitors. Once, he tilted his head until it rested lightly against her shoulder. She didn't move away. Just before dawn, the nurse told them Lucas was resting comfortably. Christopher stood, and this time his hand found hers first. No words, just a grip that said what neither of them could articulate. "I'm still here because you are." When Lena finally returned home, she didn't think about the drawing tucked between linens, or the white envelope in her apron. Instead, she thought of the swing set in the park, the warm light of the dinner table, and the quiet hours in that hospital hallway. 3 separate moments, each weaving a thread into something she couldn't yet name, but knew was growing stronger. With every meeting, it was no longer just about gratitude. It was trust, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something more. It happened without intention, at least, that's what Christopher Hale told himself later. The afternoon had been one of those easy, unremarkable visits, where Lena Brooks seemed to fold seamlessly into the rhythm of his home. The twins had sprawled on the living room floor, sorting through the contents of her tote bag with the innocent curiosity of children who believed all bags were treasure chests. She had stepped into the kitchen to refill their juice, leaving the soft, well-worn bag slouched open on the coffee table. Lucas was the one who pulled out the small, faded notebook. Its cover was frayed at the edges, the paper inside softened from years of use. "What's this?" he asked, holding it up, before flipping it open to a random page. Christopher reached for it, half to keep sticky fingers away from its pages, half to respect her privacy, but before he could close it, his eyes caught on a single line written in neat, slanted handwriting. "Be brave enough to love, even when it scares you." He didn't read another word. Didn't let himself scan for context or meaning. Instead, hey, closed the notebook carefully, the way you would handle something fragile and alive, and set it back where it belonged. When Lena returned, she didn't seem to notice anything unusual, though her gaze flicked briefly toward the bag, as if she sensed a subtle shift in the air around it. "What are you two getting into now?" she asked, her voice tinged with playful suspicion. "Candy?" Noah grinned, holding up a packet of mints he'd found. "Not candy," she laughed, "and you're too young for them." The conversation moved on, but Christopher found himself distracted. That one sentence from her notebook looped in his mind like a quiet refrain. Be brave enough to love, even when it scares you. It was deliberate, personal, written for herself, not for the world. He wondered, what moment in her life had prompted it? Loss? Hope? Or a reminder she was afraid she might one day forget? Throughout the afternoon, every time she laughed with the boys or bent to listen to one of their whispered ideas, he felt the words pressing under his ribs. There was a softness to the way she existed in a room. A presence both grounded and open that made the thought linger. Lena, for her part, couldn't quite explain why Christopher's gaze felt different that day. Parents often watched her with their children. It was natural, a way of measuring trust. But his attention had shifted. It wasn't evaluative, it was absorbing. At first, it unsettled her. She'd learned to keep her life neatly divided into compartments, each sealed tight. Christopher, looking at her like that, felt like someone brushing the dust off a box she'd worked hard to keep closed. And yet, beneath the unease, there was warmth, a flicker of something she didn't want to name. When the boys ran off to fetch their favorite books for story time, Lena began gathering the scattered game pieces they'd left behind. Christopher moved to help, their hands brushing. Once. Then again. The second time, she didn't pull away as quickly. His smile was almost imperceptible, hidden under a casual remark about Noah's competitive streak. They worked in silence, but it was a comfortable quiet, the kind that hums with unspoken things. She didn't know that his mind had returned to her notebook, or that he was weighing the truth in those words against the barricades he'd built since his wife's death. He didn't know that she was wondering if the warmth in his gaze was real or a trick of her imagination. Later, when she rose to leave, the twins clung to her legs in protest, extracting promises for the next visit. Christopher walked her to the door, a habit now so ingrained, neither acknowledged it. "Drive safe," he said, the weight in his tone making it sound like more than a routine farewell. She gave him a small nod, her eyes meeting his for a beat longer than politeness required. Something hovered there, unformed but undeniable. Before either could speak, Lucas's voice called from the living room, breaking the moment. That night, Lena sat at her small kitchen table, her notebook in front of her. She flipped through its pages slowly, pausing when she found the line "Be brave enough to love, even when it scares you." She traced the ink lightly with her finger. She had written it months ago, after watching her mother care for her father in the final months of his illness, choosing love over fear every day, even when it cost her pieces of herself. She didn't know that those same words were keeping Christopher awake across town. He sat at the edge of his bed, the city lights smudged against the window, the sentence turning over and over in his mind. Grief had been his shield, and for years, it had felt safer to live behind it. But the sight of Lena's steady hands on his son's shoulders in the park, laughter over a dinner table, the way she could anchor him in a hospital corridor, made the edges of that shield to begin to crack. He made no promises to himself that night. But he knew the words in her notebook weren't leaving him anytime soon. In the days that followed, their interactions took on subtle shifts. Brief glances held a fraction longer, casual touches that neither retreated from too quickly. When she passed him a mug of coffee, his fingers brushed hers intentionally, and she didn't step back. When she spoke with the boys, he found himself watching the curve of her smile, the way her presence seemed to slow the rush of the day. It wasn't grand declarations or dramatic moments. It was small, accumulating gestures. The steady build of trust, the quiet testing of what might happen if they let the distance between them close. One afternoon, as they stood side by side in the kitchen while the boys worked on a puzzle in the next room, Christopher reached for the jar on the top shelf, just as Lena did. Their hands met, fingers briefly tangling before he let her take it. "Thanks," she murmured, her voice low but warm. He didn't answer right away, only watched her for a moment longer than necessary before saying, "Anytime." If either of them noticed how much more that word meant, neither admitted it aloud. But in those unguarded moments, where glances carried more weight than sentences, the meaning of her written words was already taking root between them. Be brave enough to love, even when it scares you. For Christopher, it was becoming less of a line on a page and more of a quiet challenge he was starting to accept. For Lena, it was a truth she had carried for years. One she now realized might be unfolding in her own life, whether she was ready for it or not. The invitation had sat on Lena Brooks' counter for 2 days before she decided. A charity gala at the city's most exclusive venue sent, not as a formal card, but with Christopher Hale's quiet request over the phone. I'd like you to come, he'd said. Not as an employee. As my guest. She'd pictured it instantly, the glittering chandeliers, the sound of crystal and silver, the eyes that would glance at her once and decide she didn't belong. Still, something in his tone, steady, unpressured, had nudged her into saying yes. The night of the gala, the entrance hall shimmered with gold light and murmured conversation. From the moment they stepped inside, she felt the shift in the air. Some smiles were warm, genuine even. Others were polite, but thin, the kind that assessed before they welcomed. Christopher's hand rested lightly at the small of her back. A silent reassurance. That didn't waver. He introduced her deliberately. This is Lena Brooks. She's very important to me. The phrasing was simple, but the way he said it left no space for diminishment. For the first part of the evening, she stayed close, answering questions about the twins when asked, sharing a gentle anecdote or two. She noticed the warmth in people who knew her only as the woman who had saved Lucas and Noah. Gratitude outweighed curiosity there. But others scanned her dress, her hair, her skin, and she knew the look. She'd grown up, seeing it in classrooms, grocery store aisles, interviews. It was a measuring glance, one that sought to place her below. The moment came midway through the night. A tall man in an impeccably tailored suit approached with a broad smile for Christopher. Martin Crowley, Christopher greeted him. The exchange between them was warm enough until Martin's eyes shifted to Lena. And this is? He asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. Lena Brooks, Christopher replied evenly. My guest tonight. Martin's smile sharpened. Ah, the famous heroine. Quite the story, he said, glancing back to Christopher. I suppose you're keeping her around for the good press? The words were coated in feigned humor, but the edge beneath was unmistakable. Lena felt the sting in her chest, but stayed silent, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Before she could step away, Christopher's voice cut through calm, but with steel beneath it. I'm keeping her around, he said, because she's an extraordinary woman who saved my son's lives and means more to me than you could possibly measure. I'd suggest you choose your words more carefully. The conversations around them softened just enough for others to hear. Martin shifted, muttered something about just a joke, and excused himself. Christopher didn't watch him leave. His eyes stayed on her, scanning for hurt. You okay, he asked, his tone keyed her now. She swallowed, forcing a small nod. I've heard worse, she admitted, just not usually. From someone shaking my hand. His jaw tightened, but instead of pushing the moment, he guided her toward a quieter corner. I won't let anyone diminish you, he said simply. Not tonight. Not ever. Something in her chest eased, not because the comment hadn't hurt, but because of the way he had answered it. Not with a quick change of subject. Not with polite dismissal. But by planting himself firmly at her side, in front of anyone who might try to push her to the margins. The rest of the evening passed more smoothly. She noticed the way his hand would find hers. Briefly in the crowd, the way he angled his body so she was always included in the conversation. She caught the approving nods of a few guests who had witnessed the Fadia Manas exchange. And though she didn't need their validation, it struck her how unusual it was to be openly defended in such a room. By the time they stepped outside, the cool night air felt like a release. The streetlight cast a thin halo over Christopher's face as he glanced at her. I hope tonight didn't make you regret coming. She met his gaze. It didn't, she said after a pause. Not because it was easy, but because I saw something I wasn't sure about before. And what's that? He asked. That you're willing to stand with me, she said, her voice steady. Not just thank me. His expression softened, something unspoken settling between them. The drive back was quiet, but not the kind of silence that strained. When they reached her building, she turned to him before stepping out. Thank you for tonight. His answer was as direct as it had been in the ballroom. Anytime, Lena. Anywhere. That night, lying in bed, the memory of his voice lingered, not just the words, but the certainty behind them. She realized then that gratitude might have been what first connected them, but respect. Respect was what was beginning to hold them there. The road out of the city stretched long and open, the skyline fading behind them in the rearview mirror. Christopher Hale drove in uncharacteristic silence, his hands steady on the wheel, but his posture holding a kind of stillness Lena Brooks had come to recognize. The twins sat in the back, half dozing, half watching as the scenery shifted from glass and concrete to rolling fields, brushed in late afternoon light. She didn't press him about their destination. It was enough to sense that this wasn't just a casual drive. After nearly an hour, he turned onto a narrow dirt path and parked beside a wide, open field where a single oak tree stood tall, unshaken, its branches stretching out as though to embrace the horizon. The boys perked up instantly, tumbling out of the car. Christopher moved to the trunk and pulled out a coiled length of rope and a small, handcrafted wooden seat. I always meant to put this up, he said, his voice low enough that the wind might have carried it away if she hadn't been listening closely. He glanced toward the oak. We came here once before the boys were born. Talked about building a swing so they could grow up with this view. He didn't say her name, his late wife, but Lena felt her presence in the quiet space between his words. Without needing instruction, Lena knelt to hold the rope steady while he climbed partway up, looping them over one of the tree's thickest branches. The boys circled below, their laughter bright against the hush of the field. She kept them back, reminding them this was important work. When the knots were tied, and the swing hung freely, Lucas was the first to climb on. Christopher gave him a firm push, the wooden seat creaking as it swung higher, carrying the boys' delighted shouts into the crisp air. Noah clapped from the side, his turn already. Promised. Lena stepped back, watching the scene unfold. The light caught in Christopher's hair, in the easy curve of his mouth. There was no guarded distance in his expression now, only something open, unshielded. Joy, yes. But layered with a release she hadn't seen before, like the slow unclenching of a hand that had been tight for far too long. When it was Noah's turn, Christopher's push was just as steady. His laughter came easier this time, without the catch of hesitation. Lena felt herself smiling, the image etching into her memory, the two boys swinging beneath the branches, the father behind them, the tree, standing as witness to a moment long overdue. Eventually, the boys grew distracted by some private game, racing around the tree in circles. Only they seemed to understand. Christopher stepped back from the swing, brushing his palms together. For a moment, he simply looked at Lena, his gaze steady but softened by something vulnerable. I've been living in what was for too long, he said finally. Every day, I replay the life I thought we'd keep forever. And it's kept me from seeing what's right in front of me. She didn't speak right away. The boys' laughter filled the space, but didn't crowd out the weight of his words. She took a small step closer, enough that the space between them felt intentional. It's hard to let go of what we've lost, she said quietly. Sometimes it feels like letting go is the same as forgetting. He shook his head. It's not forgetting. It's making space for something else. For someone else. His voice dipped slightly on the last part, but it was still clear. Her breath caught, not because the words were unexpected, but because of how simply they were spoken. Her fingers, almost without thought, reached for his. When her hand found his, there was no flinch, no awkwardness. Just the warmth of contact, and the unspoken agreement it carried. He closed his fingers around hers, not tightly, but in a way that anchored them both. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The oak's branches swayed above them, a slow and quiet witness. The boys, still caught in their game, had no idea that something had shifted under that tree. Something small, but undeniable. They stayed like that for a while, the breeze moving around them, the rope swing swaying lazily in the corner of her vision. It was a simple scene, but for Christopher, it felt like reclaiming something he thought was gone forever. The possibility of new memories, unshadowed by loss. For Lena, it was the quiet recognition that she had stepped into a space in his life where the past no longer locked the door to the present. As the sun began to sink, painting the sky in muted golds and pinks, the boys' energy waned. Cheeks flushed, they wandered back toward their father. Christopher ruffled their hair, promising they could come back soon. They gathered the extra rope, packed the small bag, and began walking toward the car. Lena glanced back once more at the oak. It stood exactly as it had when they'd arrived. Unchanged. But she knew something between her and Christopher had shifted in its shade. She didn't name it. Naming it might make it too real too soon. But she felt it all the same. As they reached the car, Christopher's hand brushed hers again. This time, she didn't wait for him to close the space. She slipped her fingers back into his, the gesture as natural as breathing. Neither of them looked at the other, but both knew what had passed between them. Under the oak. Not a promise spoken aloud, but one quietly understood. They would no longer live only in what was, but in what could be. Snow had been falling since late afternoon, wrapping the city in a hush that made every sound feel softer. Closer. When Christopher Hale asked Lena Brooks to meet him and the boys on the rooftop, she almost smiled at the symmetry. This was where it had all begun, the edge of the world, 64 stories up, where fear had once eclipsed joy. When the elevator doors opened, she stepped into a winter scene. The skyline was blurred by flurries, the terrace lights casting a golden halo over the snow. Lucas and Noah were already there, bundled in thick jackets, waving with mittened hands. Christopher stood just behind them, his expression warm but unreadable, like someone holding a moment too important to rush. "We wanted to bring you here," he said, "because this is where everything changed." The boys could barely contain themselves. "Dad has something to say," Noah blurted, earning a playful frown from Christopher before he knelt down beside them. "Remember when I told you forever means the people you can always count on?" The twins nodded solemnly. "Well, we were wondering if you'd like Lena to be part of our forever." Her breath caught, the cold biting at her cheeks, but before she could answer, both boys shouted yes and ran into her arms. She knelt, hugging them close, their warmth pressing into her as the snow clung to her coat. Christopher stepped forward, his arms joining theirs, until all four were wrapped together in a circle of quiet, steady love. She looked up at him through the falling snow and found no hesitation in his eyes. "I think I already am," she said softly. And just like that, the rooftop became not a place of fear, but a Fesajov landmark of something new, something lasting. Family is not just about blood, it's about the people who choose to stand with you, protect you, and love you without conditions. Sometimes, the place that once held your greatest fear can become the place that defines your greatest joy. What do you think makes a forever family? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please like the video and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories that celebrate love, courage, and second chances. Your support helps us keep these stories alive for people who need them most.